You don't want militarized people in the streets just roaming around, snatching people up, many of which turn out to actually be U.S. citizens that just don't have their papers on them. Are we really going to be the Gestapo? Where's your papers? Is that what we've come to?
This is the moment when the revenge campaign stops sounding like a slogan and starts behaving like an instrument. Picture a breaking news chyron across the bottom of the screen, a criminal subpoena delivered to the sitting chair of the Federal Reserve, Jerome Powell, and the first people to flinch are not pundits, not opponents, not the usual targets. The first people to flinch are markets. The first people to flinch are institutions, because when you drag the Fed into political retaliation, you are not threatening a man, you are threatening an assumption that interest rates are not a campaign lever, that monetary policy is not a loyalty test, that the nation's money is not a toy you can shake until it spits out a sugar high. And the shock is not just the paper, the shock is the posture behind it. New reporting described in the raw material is blunt. The president is angry his Department of Justice is not moving fast enough to go after his targets. He attacks his own team as weak. He attacks Attorney General Pam Bondi as weak and ineffective. Translate that like an adult. Weak in this context means unwilling or unable to push fact-free pressure through a system that still has judges in it. Ineffective means the courts keep asking for lawful basis, evidence, and cause, and the administration keeps showing up with vendetta and volume. So the stakes land immediately, not later. If prosecutions are called in by politicians without basis, that is selective prosecution in the ugliest sense. Law as punishment for disfavored speech and disfavored people. That is not a partisan complaint. That is a constitutional collision, equal protection, due process, and the integrity of prosecutorial power being treated like an arm of the campaign. And when the target list expands beyond Powell, when it becomes assorted critics, you don't get a narrow scandal, you get a governing theory. Dissent is a trigger, disagreement is a predicate, and the machinery is supposed to do the rest. Now picture the three-pressure system that makes this different from the usual Washington noise. Court pressure, because subpoenas are litigated and judges exist to ask based on what? Financial pressure, because the Fed is the confidence engine, and confidence is the one thing you cannot order into existence. Political pressure, because the minute you start weaponizing prosecution, you force every ally to decide whether they are signing up for governance or for a purge. Those pressures feed each other. Courts rejecting overreach makes the White House angrier. Anger produces more overreach. More overreach spooks markets and institutions. Spooked institutions tighten the screws on politics. Donors, lenders, partners, governors, mayors, everyone who needs stability. That's why the Powell domino, as described, falls hard. Powell is not a celebrity. Powell is plugged into the wiring. Attack the wiring, and you don't just shock the target, you shock the building. And you can see the hypocrisy meter flicker in real time. Voices that cheered lawfare when it was aimed outward start calling it reckless when it touches someone system critical. The Wall Street Journal line referenced in the raw material, Lawfare for Dummies, lands because it captures the mismatch between amateur revenge and professional institutions. This isn't chess. This is somebody knocking the board over and demanding the pieces call it strategy. So this is your opening reality. A presidency trying to discipline the Fed, trying to discipline the DOJ, trying to discipline the opposition all at once with compulsory process and public intimidation. Watch the frame shift. It stops being politics and becomes process. It stops being messaging and becomes records. It stops being strong and becomes reckless. And once you reach the point where the Fed, the courts, and the credibility of the Department of Justice are on the same battlefield, the headline is no longer the subpoena. The headline is the system being tested for whether it still enforces limits. Trust reset, quickly, because serious people don't need mythology. They need the actual balance sheet. The Department of Justice has already done quite a lot for this president, as the legal analysis in the raw material makes plain, deprioritizing certain use of force prosecutions, leaning into a retribution posture even when it doesn't reach completion, and using the mere willingness to investigate as a weapon to deter and chill dissent. That is the baseline. This is not a pure institution heroically holding the line. This is an institution already bent, already pressured, already enlisted, and the president is still furious because bending is not the same as winning. Court is where performance ends. Court is where the record starts. Court is where the judge asks the question the political machine hates most. Show your lawful basis. And the dirty secret is that the investigation itself is the punishment. Even a baseless probe forces legal fees, forces disclosures, forces reputational damage, forces time under oath. That is why DOJ norms matter. Predication, supervision, separation from partisan command. When those norms are treated as optional, coercion replaces law. Now, the deep legal explanation expanded because the words being thrown around here, selective prosecution, cause, independence, have real meaning. And the meaning is the point. Selective prosecution is not merely, they went after my guy. It is government power aimed on impermissible grounds, viewpoint retaliation, personal animus, factional punishment. Prosecutors have broad discretion, yes, but they do not have a blank check to use criminal process as a political club. The constitutional core is simple. The state's coercive tools must be justified by lawful purpose, not by grievance. When the raw material says prosecutions are being called in without a basis, that is the predicate problem. You do not get to decide the target and then reverse engineer the crime. You need articulable facts, lawful jurisdiction, relevance, and a chain that can survive a judge's glare. A criminal subpoena is not a PR stunt. It is compulsory process backed by contempt power. It drags people into a system where ignoring it carries penalties. That is why the choice of target matters so much. Jerome Powell is not a random critic. He sits atop an institution designed by statute, by term structure, and by hard-earned custom to be insulated from presidential whims. The Fed exists to resist the temptation that always comes with politics. Cut rates now, pump the sugar high, and let the bill land later. When a president is publicly angry about interest rates and then criminal process appears at the Fed chair's door, the inference is not subtle. It reads as coercion through law. The raw material also flags the parallel battlefield sitting right next to Powell, the dispute over Lisa Cook, a Federal Reserve governor, and whether a president can remove Fed officials with or without cause. Cause is not decorative. Cause is the firewall between independent governance and executive control. If cause can be faked, then independence is a costume. If cause can be ignored, then the Fed becomes another arm of the executive and monetary policy becomes campaign policy. That is why the Supreme Court's pending argument matters. The legal question is framed as removal authority, but the real question is whether the president can take control of the nation's money by taking control of the people who set its terms. And timing is part of the evidence. The raw discussion notes Powell's term ends in May. That end date is the built-in off-ramp. It doesn't have to be this way, but picking this fight anyway on the eve of high-stakes Supreme Court argument turns a legal dispute into a stress test of institutional limits. The administration wants a DOJ that behaves like a political instrument and a Fed that behaves like a political instrument. The DOJ can be pushed, staffed, leaned on. The Fed is harder. That difficulty is exactly why the coercion is escalating. Now, the escalation where the courtroom starts tightening the vice and the judiciary becomes the hard surface the presidency keeps running into. Courts do not respond to anger. Courts respond to authority, jurisdiction, and records. So when the administration swings at the Fed, it runs straight into the fact that the Fed has long been treated as different from a cabinet agency, different from a regulator. The president can bully with a phone call, different in the one way that matters. Independence is the point. The raw exchange captures the public confusion. People say the president runs the government, then forget that judges also receive federal paychecks and still rule against presidents every day. That's separation of powers in action, and the Fed, while not its own branch, has lived inside a similar norm. So watch what happens when that norm is tested in litigation. First, lower courts start demanding actual malfeasance, not he annoyed me, not rates aren't where I want them, actual misconduct. Second, emergency orders and stays become the battlefield because an administration that wants immediate control cannot tolerate slow adjudication. Third, the Supreme Court becomes the final pressure valve, and the raw material is already mapping the terrain. The court has a case pending over the Fed governor removal question, and the judges know what's at stake because everyone knows what's at stake. Control the Fed, juice the numbers, chase the housing boost, set the table for midterms. The raw discussion even points to how this court absorbs the moment. Skepticism in tariff cases argued after a political backlash, and awareness of zeitgeist without acting like pundits. Put it plainly, this court protects certain structures because those structures protect the court. An assault on the Fed reads like an assault on the judiciary, a bid to control a referee. That is why names like Roberts and Barrett come up in the raw analysis as potential skeptics, not because they are heroes, because institutional self-preservation is a real force. And timing becomes a second argument, even if nobody says it out loud. Picking a public fight with Powell on the eve of oral argument over Fed independence isn't subtle, and justices don't miss signals like that. They read pressure, they read coercion, they read the attempt to turn cause into an empty word. The other escalation is political, and it's self-inflicted. The reporting describes as the president berated his own team for not moving fast enough, which broadcasts a message to every prosecutor and career official. Loyalty is measured by willingness to target. That is how you trigger resignations. The raw material gives a concrete example: prosecutors in the Civil Rights Division resigning after a clash over a Minnesota shooting case, with additional resignations tied to a push to investigate the victim's widow. That is the pattern in miniature. pressure from above to aim prosecutorial power where politics wants it aimed, and professionals who still recognize lines choosing the exit over complicity. This is where the lawfare for dummies label becomes more than a zinger. The administration can throw subpoenas and open investigations, but it cannot force judges to bless them without basis. It cannot force juries to convict on resentment. It cannot force appellate courts to pretend retaliation is law. So escalation turns into a sequence of rejection, motions narrowed, overreach checked, subpoenas litigated, institutions calling the bluff. Every judicial no forces a choice between backing down and escalating into open defiance. Open defiance has a price: contempt findings, sanctions, suppression of evidence, written rebukes that live forever. And now the image versus reality collapse becomes visible. Image says strongman, command, domination. Reality says dockets, deadlines, judges, and a record that does not care about charisma. Image says we'll go after them. Reality says courts ask based on what? Image says they're weak. Reality says the system is not designed to let you run prosecutions on fumes. Every time rage has to be translated into a filing, bravado shrinks, claims narrow, proof becomes the issue. That's the exposure. That's the collapse. Now the options break down because at this stage, the president's menu is a list of bad outcomes dressed up as choices. Option 1, retreat. Let Powell's term run, stop the theatrics, accept that the Fed is not a campaign office. Retreat would calm markets and reduce the risk of a humiliating court loss that cements limits on executive power. But retreat costs the one thing this posture is built to feed: the promise of vengeance, the promise of dominance, the promise that the state will be weaponized on demand. Retreat is politically expensive inside a movement trained to treat backing down as betrayal. Option 2, double down through the DOJ, more subpoenas, more investigations, more targets, more pressure on career staff, and if necessary, more purges at the top when leaders refuse to sign their names to junk. That is the path the raw material already sketches. The president attacks DOJ leaders as weak, wants faster action, wants the retribution campaign to move with less friction, but doubling down collapses into a staffing crisis and a legitimacy crisis. Every resignation is a flare, every leak is an alarm bell, every court loss compounds. A DOJ seen as a personal weapon becomes a DOJ that juries distrust, judges scrutinize, and institutions treat as politically radioactive. Option 3, swap the human face of the operation, fire the people who won't do it, elevate the people who will. That means replacing leadership with loyalists, leaning on acting appointments, daring the Senate to stop you, and daring the courts to police your intent. It looks decisive for a day. Then it becomes a confession in motion. You are not seeking impartial enforcement, you are seeking willing operators. And once that becomes the public fact pattern, every subsequent move is litigated through that lens. Motive, because the staffing tells the story. Option 4, try to seize the Fed directly, push the removal without cause theory, accelerate the Lisa Cook fight, test the Supreme Court's patience, attempt to rewrite decades of independence in one brutal shove. This option is dangerous precisely because it looks efficient. It promises immediate leverage, lower rates, housing stimulus, market sugar, the appearance of competence. But it risks the kind of backlash that doesn't show up first in speeches. It shows up in bond yields and capital flight. The court may not follow the daily gossip, but it follows systems that keep the country functioning. Assaulting the Fed reads like assaulting the judiciary, a bid to control a referee. That invites resistance. Option 5, go around the law. Public intimidation, back-channel pressure, rhetorical threats designed to make officials self-censor. That, too, is visible in the atmosphere described: chilling dissent, silencing critics, using the willingness to investigate as the punishment. But intimidation as a governing model is brittle. It works until a target has resources and institutional backing to fight. It works until markets, courts, and bureaucrats decide the threat is more dangerous than the retaliation. Then it flips. Intimidation becomes evidence, and evidence becomes constraint. Now, the rule of law frame, because this is not moral theater, it's the core conflict. The rule of law is the idea that power is constrained by rules you do not get to rewrite the moment you need them. Accountability is the idea that government coercion must be justified by lawful purpose, not personal grievance. If you call in prosecutions without basis, you are not enforcing order, you are declaring allegiance as the standard and converting equality before the law into a factional tool. That is why selective prosecution is both corrosive and illegal. It makes the justice system serve the ruler, not the public. So the pressure keeps building because every option worsens one of the three fronts: court finance, politics, retreat angers the base, escalation invites judicial defeat, seizing the Fed spooks markets, intimidation triggers institutional rebellion. This is the trap of governing by vengeance. It creates a demand for constant escalation, and escalation is exactly what independent institutions are built to resist, full stop. Now the political and institutional fallout, where the coalition cracks in ways the White House cannot script, start with the bureaucracy. Resignations in the Civil Rights Division are not inside inside baseball drama. They are indicators of a department at war with itself. They signal career officials believe they are being pushed toward politicized targets, and in a department that depends on credibility to win in court, credibility is capital. Spend it recklessly, and you go broke when you need it most. Then you get the establishment recoil. The raw material captures it. The revenge tour looks clever to its architects until it hits someone the system considers essential, and suddenly the tone changes. Analysts who tolerate chaos on the margins start warning about chaos at the center. That is not empathy, that is self-defense. Watch the risk managers, credit committees tightening, insurers rewriting terms, counterparties demanding collateral. Politics can shout, risk cannot. Risk writes spreadsheets, not speeches. And spreadsheets are where this administration's appetite for retaliation gets priced every day. Move to the media ecosystem, because this is where the image story starts collapsing on the right as well as the left. The raw material points to Joe Rogan, an influential voice who gave the president a massive platform, using that same platform to criticize ICE policy, warning against militarized people roaming the streets and snatching people up, including U.S. citizens who don't have papers on them. That isn't a niche liberal critique. That is a friendly megaphone describing enforcement as untethered. When that happens, the reputational cost accelerates, and the administration can't dismiss it as the other side. Now connect it back to Powell and the Fed, because that is where institutional fallout becomes economic fallout. The Fed is the confidence engine. You can argue about inflation and criticize decisions, but once you signal that rates are being targeted by political retaliation, you turn monetary policy into a partisan commodity. Markets price that, lenders price that, employers price that. If the real objective is the sugar high of low rates heading into midterms, the irony is brutal. Intimidation drains confidence, and you can't order confidence back into existence. Then comes the judiciary's part in the fallout. Because the Supreme Court argument on the Fed removal question sits like a loaded chamber, the raw analysis makes clear the court treats the Fed as almost sacrosanct, and that picking a fight with Powell on the eve of argument looks like recklessness. Recklessness is not invisible to judges. Judges live in timing. Judges live in patterns. Judges see when legal doctrine is being used as camouflage for a political project. When a president tries to make cause mean because I said so, courts either enforce the limit or surrender it. There is no neutral option. Now, the inevitable ending, and it is inevitable because it's procedural. Powell's term runs to May. The court hears argument. Lower courts issue orders. The DOJ bleeds staff and credibility. The political coalition fractures under tactics that look like state power for personal ends. And the system does what systems do when pressed past tolerance. It responds with constraints, written decisions, injunctions, stays, contempt warnings, market reactions that don't care about speeches. The administration can rage, threaten, demand faster vengeance, call everyone weak, but the calendar doesn't move for anger, and the record doesn't bend for loyalty. Picture the final shot the way it actually plays out. Not fireworks, not a cinematic gotcha, but a slow tightening that becomes unavoidable. A court sets a date, a judge demands a basis, a filing fails, a resignation lands, a market reprices. The image of omnipotence collapses into the reality of governance, rules, institutions, and consequences. And the consequence here is simple and non-negotiable. When you try to weaponize law against the independent pillars of the system either reasserts the rule of law or it admits it no longer has one. That is where this ends.